welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Bazigos. He received his Ph.D. in organizational psychology from Columbia University, has past experience at KPMG, McKinsey, and currently works at Accenture as a managing director. Welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome.
Hey guys, great to be with you.
How you doing today on a fine Saturday afternoon?
Doing just fine. How are you guys?
Good. We're doing great. Thanks for joining us today. I know we ran into each other a couple times at the Metro events.
That's right.
And I know Brandon and I both always hear you ask questions. They're always so thought-provoking. Like, it makes us think. And I mean, this makes a good question, but it's made me and Brandon say to each other, we're like, we need to talk to Michael just more in depth. Obviously, he has a lot to teach us.
Well, sometimes teaching is just learning to ask the next level of question.
There's our quote.
It's a great saying. You could always, I feel like you could always tell a lot by like the questions they ask. It's not just like asking just to hear themselves speak, but like actually asking to make, people curious about like, oh, I've never thought of it that way. Because I know everyone's heard those
question. I try to follow the advice that somebody once gave. It was pretty funny when he said it. If you're going to ask a question, audience, ask a question. Very often people will just give you a theory and, there's no real question at the end of it. It's like, enough about me. What do you think of my theory?
Oh yeah, we've definitely seen some of those. I mean, honestly, it's good advice to just talk about this for a second when we're talking about IO students and in their own programs. Like, don't be afraid to ask questions, because I feel like Joe and I, when we were in class, we learn the most from the discussion following questions that are in our classes. Like, we learn about the material, obviously, but when you like dive into it with follow-up, that's where it really comes from. And I mean, Michael, you kind of attest to that in our Metro events, because you help us learn more about what the speakers are talking about when you ask those great questions.
Yeah, at Metro events, I always think through, how is this likely to show up or play out in a real life scenario in the workplace, with all of the various stakeholders and the political tension that creates as a mise-en-scène or a background. How exactly would that play out? What are the risks? What are the rewards? Have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? And how do you address it? I think that's valuable for people to hear. And I think it's valuable for me to ask, because I always learn from the answers that the different presenters give.
No, absolutely. And I kind of want to piggyback off what Brandon was saying. As graduate students who are still kind of new to the field, sometimes we don't fully understand what's going on at these presentations. We find it interesting, but when a lot of the theories start coming up and the data, we're still learning how to process it all. So when people ask those questions, it kind of reinforces the like certain aspects of the presentation and helps like us develop those ideas. So you're totally right. Like, it helps us kind of just learn it.
Well, that's good. I think a good war story is, just as valuable as like any 10 or 15 minute, probe of a data matrix.
Yeah. So what we want to get into to like the bulk of the episode today, we highlighted it in the introduction. You've had an amazing career so far at the different companies and positions that you've worked at. Just looking, I was like, wow. I mean, we can't wait to ask you so many questions. But I guess to start out like as a high level question, when you were going for your PhD in organizational psychology and first learning about this field, and we wanted to ask this because I know a lot of other students think about this way too. Did you know the type of work you would have been able to do, or how successful that you were able to be when you were first starting your PhD? Because you've come so far, and I wanted to know, were you thinking like this when you were first going for your degree?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for the question. I knew that I wanted to work in something that involved psychology, that involved analysis, because I've just always been drawn to analytical things. Chess is my favorite game, and also didn't emphasize math at the expense of words, or the reverse of that. I wanted all of those things. I knew that I wanted a good income. I knew that I wanted to do what I would call the trifecta, which is to be able to, work, consult, work as a consultant. I wanted to consult, uh, research, and teach. That to me was the trifecta. And that was my, early ambition. And I realized that to do many of those things, I needed to enter a doctoral program. I already had a master's from NYU in what was, just to date myself, it was called back then, it was offered from the Department of IO Psychology, Industrial and Organizational Psychology, but the degree, the physical piece of paper that I received, endorsed by the New York State Department of Regents, with all of the rights, privileges, and immunities thereunto appertaining, said the degree is in personnel psychology. And if you think of that term, that is such a dated term. Um, I'm sure they've changed it since, or I hope they've changed it since. But that was my master's degree. It was the NYU program, so it was more on the I side of IO than on the O. Obviously, the Columbia program was more on the O side of IO. So I knew I was going to get deeper into issues of leadership, culture, enterprise level consulting, and that's a uniquely different thing than most of the academic experience that people listening to this will have, because most programs, at least in the U.S., are more I than O. And I don't necessarily mean industrial. I mean focusing on the individual as the unit of analysis. Think about it. The number one most monetizable, kind of outcome that an IO psychologist can have, that is pretty easy to do these days, is focus on selection. And the better the selection ratio you can get, the better the utility you can demonstrate. And utility is obviously the monetization of having a more valid way to bring people in, a more valid way to predict who will be a high performer or not. Um, but the unit of analysis is the individual and the role. It's doing the job analysis of the role, figuring out what are the KSAOs that are critical to success on that role, and then finding ways to test human beings and get kind of an advance, make a more educated guess about how well they would be able to fulfill those, assuming they were properly, trained, motivated, and led. So the organizational part doesn't necessarily look at the individual as a unit of analysis, although it can. It also looks at the group as a unit of analysis, and that's why it was the Columbia program has a very long history of partnership with social psychology. In fact, the degree from Columbia, it is a Ph.D. It's called social organizational psychology.
Hmm.
So I jumped from a master's in personnel psychology to a doctoral degree in social-organizational psychology. And at the time that the doctoral degree was announced, it had just gone through a new recertification, and that was the new name. A lot of my colleagues weren't too clear that they wanted the word social in there. They felt that this was at a time when America was trying to, quote unquote, retool itself for excellence. That was the big buzz phrase. And they weren't too sure. They felt it sounded too soft and squishy. But really, figuring out if you really want to get your hands on the wheels and levers of organizational effectiveness, you've got to be looking at groups. People behave differently in groups than they do as individuals. You've got to look at how groups interact between each other. So you've got to look at what's going on within the group, between groups, and then if you roll it all up to the top, enterprise. And so I've spent at least half my career doing enterprise level analysis, both within the enterprise, looking at the differences between different business units and linking soft things to hard things, linking group scores on employee engagement surveys to quantitative outcomes of financial performance, and understanding which groups were performing better. And there's a pretty good predictive and in fact causative causal relationship. It's more the case that employee engagement leads financial performance, which is the lagging variable, than the opposite. We've run it both ways. You have to, using cross-lagged panel designs. And I've also had the opportunity, and I feel very fortunate that I have had access to these data sets working in large consulting firms, um, like McKinsey, like Accenture. You are blessed. One is blessed to be able to look at the differences between companies. So I can take enterprise scores of organizational health and look at enterprise levels of financial metrics that the CEO and the CFO are compensated on. And so that gets their attention right away, and determine what the differences are, and figure out what the likely causal elements, within on the people side are that are creating differences for a company compared to a basket of its competitors or the industry in general. And that's been really good too. Now, I never knew I was going to do that level when I first started. I just knew that I wanted to consult, research, and teach. That to bring it back to the question to kick this off.
And that's honestly like really interesting because you got to give us a little bit of a breakdown, Michael, of your career and some of the types of work you've done as well. And Joe, like you said, that question was great because I think that it speaks to like there's an idea of what we want to do, but then Michael, you spoke to how it like took you in that direction, and then like look how it's came now. I want to now kind of dive into maybe some of the work that you do
Mm-hmm.
specifically, Michael, you were talking about like working with executive teams. Joe and I had the opportunity in one of our classes to learn how to like work with executives and like just speaking to executives. But I think that with your work now, you could kind of speak to this. So the question is like, what type of IO psychology preparation did you have when working with these executives? Because obviously, like psychology and business are different fields. So, like, where did the prep come for you to start working and start speaking to these high level individuals from like an IO perspective and bring in the business side?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I'll boil it down to this. I had my early exposure to consulting was, through consulting. Price Waterhouse Coopers. I had just finished my coursework in Price Waterhouse. I interviewed and got a consulting role at PwC, which then had a management consulting services division. That's what it was called. There were about 30,000 of us in that. What I didn't know was that 6 years later we would be sold to IBM, and I involuntarily became an IBMer. But then later, gratefully, realized that I'd become an IBMer. When I was working at PwC, success was not necessarily convincing a client that they should hire you to do work. That ended up being the easy part. The hard part, working inside a professional services firm, is that you have to convince the owner of the relationship between the professional services firm and the client, the ultimate client, that you have something to offer, that you have to come across as credible to them, because they'll be looking at you in your first interaction with them, running the sort of scenario in their head while they're even talking to you, that can I see this guy in front of the top team that I deal with on a regular basis? And that was really important. Now, at PwC did not begin as a consulting organization, and it is not a consulting organization. It is like the other big four, like the other three of the big four. They're an accountancy. They're public accountants. That's their main business. That has always been their main business. That was their main business back when I joined. It still is. And the people who hold the top relationship uh, for different clients of PwC back then, and now that's still true, and it's true of the others as well, is usually the audit partner. The audit partner usually has a direct line to the CFO of that organization, and sometimes the CEO, and sometimes sometimes the head of strategy, definitely the chief operating officer, because It's a gigantic financial connection between CFO and COO. And all of these people, and the CEO and CFO are compensated on the basis, more so than anybody else, of shareholder value. So I realized that this was the stakeholder group I had to be pitching to. And what I developed was a way of linking soft things like employee engagement scores, survey scores, measures of culture, to hard things like shareholder value, return on invested capital, EBITDA. Those are things that had to be in my vocabulary. I had to know how they worked, and I did learn how they worked because I was working with people who were really, really good at the financial metrics part, but had never thought of creating, multiple regression models that tested the the measurable human side to the measurable business side. And that's what got me credibility. So that was on the analytics side. Now I'm talking to everybody on this podcast thinking that people are more junior in their careers. I would say that there are success. I'm going to preach a little bit, and this is food for thought. I think success is having something to say about each of three circles and trying to live at the intersection of a Venn diagram that three circles could create. The first circle is analytics. You have to know your analytics. That's, to my mind, that's what gets you into higher levels of the organization. Because you could say, all the soft stuff that you think is woo-woo or BS or can't be measured, it can be measured reliably, validly, and it is a forward indicator of how well you're going to do on your quarterly financials. That's really, so getting the analytics right is important. Having domain expertise is also important. And here's the rub. About, I don't know, 800,000 people from around the world have just walked into the people analytics space. They know how to do analytics. They always did. But they don't necessarily know how people, groups, or organizations work. And so, at Accenture, I have access, I speak from experience, I have access to at least 6,000 data scientists. I can, pick and choose for whatever engagements that we're working on, but not all of them are built the same. Most of them don't have a background like people on this call, on this podcast do, in psychology, in organizational psychology, or industrial and organizational psychology. They don't really understand how motivation is measured, how things work, what the outcome of something means. And because they don't know what the numbers mean, they just smash numbers around and come up with some really compelling things that mean nothing at a practical level. So you have to have your domain expertise and continue to understand what motivates human beings. How do people operate in groups differently than how they operate alone? How do groups interact with one another? These are important things to know as your background. I call that domain expertise. And also, how does HR work, and how in organizations do organizations manage the people side of the equation? Extremely important. That's domain expertise. So one circle is analytics, the other is domain expertise. The third one is what I'll call consulting skills. And what I mean by consulting skills is that which increases your credibility and minimizes the probability that you'll come out with what I call a whopper, something that is so dumb or reveals such little insight that people will not say anything, but quietly cross your name off further meetings and invitations. That's important. Being in a meeting with executives, understanding when to intervene by talking, when it's better not to intervene, and maybe ask a question later, offline, have a sidebar with somebody. These are important skills, and that's just as important. Also, I think in consulting skills, I would put data visualization, putting things out that make sense to a business leader. So, and a common mistake that graduate students do, really smart graduate students, who haven't really thought through the consulting implications, how you're coming off to the client as a consultant is, you know, top level executives, if you ask them what they know about correlations, they know something about correlations. They know how they're used. They certainly use them in business. You know, financial analysts use correlation all the time. But if you get up in front of a bunch of people and you get really excited about this great model that you have and what a great R you have or beta, and you put a bunch of, you know, the stuff that would excite a professor up in front of them, that might be the last time you ever get invited to speak to those people again. It's much easier to dumb it down, and this will feel like dumbing it down coming out of a graduate program. It's much better to create a bar chart than show a scatter plot. I speak from experience. Don't make my mistakes. Learn from my scar tissue. You know, my experience has been putting scatter plots up in front and asking people to focus on the broad pattern. Will work for some, and inevitably, at least 30% of the people in the room will have come up as transactional discrepancy seeking machines. And they will look at each of the outlier dots on your scatter plot and ask, who was that? Who was that? Or which unit was that? Which unit was that? And you'll be completely derailed. People will miss the conversation will go in a completely different direction. Doesn't matter how good a skilled a facilitator you are. Somebody's going to bang on the drum and say, look, this, you know, they'll find proof. A scatter plot can prove anything to these people. They don't get the larger picture. They don't see the forest through the trees or through the data. So better to, rather than show a scatter plot, if you have a scatter plot that shows a positive, you know, linear relationship between two people, and you showed it as scatter, you're dead. If though you show it just as a straight line that summarizes all of the data, you might be able to get away with giving a regression line. What might be even better is showing two bars. Just divide your data into stuff, you know, bisect your regression line, figure out all the data that's to the left of the regression line, bunch it into a bar, a single bar that rises to a certain height. To the right of it, put the other bar that will rise to a taller height. Put the numbers on top in dollars, not in betas, not in R's, not in Z's, not in any kind of, you know, don't talk about heteroscedasticity. Don't talk about any of that stuff. Just put dollars there and say, you know, on average, if we could have, if everybody we selected going forward fit into the pattern that we were able to demonstrate in this proof of concept pilot, you would have, this firm would have like a $13.5 million revenue uplift on a 3-year compound annual growth rate basis. It's called CAGR, CAGR. That's the way to present it. And so that's an important part of consulting, learning how to do it, giving the logical flow of what you tested, why you tested, explaining why you tested something, why it's important to the business of the people who are running it. That's just as important as having domain expertise and understanding, you know, what somebody's, you know, MBTI is. And it's just as important as knowing, you know, how to do analytics, both in the old style way, classical parametric statistics, and in the new way, machine learning statistics.
So it's some great points, and the thread that I want to kind of pull out and tie it all together is that tying the analytics piece back to the business, because I know, as you said it, um, as graduate students, we learn how to be great with the numbers, and then how to actually put it into the business to drive results. It can kind of get lost in between. I know Brandon was saying before, we've been learning in our one of our seminar classes how to accurately display the data to an executive without saying, here's the average and the standard deviation.
Yeah.
They're gonna be like, standard deviation, like tell me like what this actually means. And I liked how you were saying about the data visualization, about the graphs, and like straying away from the scatter plots, because you're right, there could be stray data points that might not be significant, but to like an executive board, they'd be like, "Oh, what is that guy doing over there? Or what's that dot in the bottom right corner? Like, we got to
Right.
change that." As the analytics people, we're like, that doesn't really mean much. Let's look at like the big picture. But it's a great point that you brought up. I kind of want to ask, when it comes to that like visualization, were there any like tools or softwares that you learned either recently or in like your graduate program that really elevated those uh, those presentation skills, because I know personally when I was trying to learn like PowerPoint, Brandon knows this well. Like I'm terrible with anything creative. Like I could do the numbers all day long, but when it comes to displaying it, I have trouble. And it's something that I really need to work on. So what are like some, I don't know, I guess skills you developed?
You know, I don't know that I'm not the worst, but I'm not the greatest person at data visualization. The great thing about working in big firms is that we have people who are excellent at it, really, really excellent at it. They produce our firm's annual reports and so forth.
Found your
They're really
job,
good
Joe.
at it. But I do remember, and this goes some time back. I do remember that there was a time when I was involved on a small secret, super secret team that was redesigning the top line of a large consulting company, actually of PwC just before it got sold. PwC's management consulting services was going to do an organizational uh, restructuring of itself. And I was on a team, we collected a lot of data. And to your point about data visualization, the best feedback I'd ever gotten in that entire firm just before we got sold to IBM was when I went into SPSS and I found a little tool. I'm sure it's improved since then, where I could take state by state data, like U.S. state by state data, and also country by country data for the European and for the non-U.S. part of the firm, and put numbers in it, showing what their percentage of profitability was, and not just putting. And I put the numbers in, but then I created a heat map.
Sorry, you did
So
this in SPSS?
I
This
did
was
this in SPSS. This was available in SPSS in the early 2000s. So I'm sure it's improved. Look, it's in Excel also. I know they have a map. You can download these maps now, and you load the data in, whatever the data is that you want to display. In this case, it was financial data, just to show how profitable different operations were, because there was a geographical model in place in the structure of the firm at that time. So that it was important to be able to differentiate between profitable regions and non-profitable and less profitable regions in order to figure out where you wanted to focus or how you might want to structure your organization. It was an important data point. And so when people could get, I think the acid test is, can people see your picture, your graphic, and in a blink, in a Malcolm Gladwell blink, like by the book of that name, can they in like 1 second intuitively get what the message is? Or could they not? When I showed that heat map of the world and like where the profit centers were, boy, people got that right off the bat. And it matched their experience. They sort of knew what the numbers were. They didn't really know what the numbers were, but they had an intuitive sense of what was true and what wasn't true. So it passed the sniff test. Everybody got in a second. And I was privately told that was the best work I ever did. I don't think it was, but they thought it was, and that's what counted.
That's what matters.
That is all that matters. That's so funny. No, I mean, it's great to talk about data visualization, and I think that like as we spoke to earlier, ties into not just like understanding the company, but the consulting piece, as you spoke to, Michael. As someone who works in consulting, definitely learning to speak the language is really important, whether you're talking about internally at your own company or externally to the other companies. But to kind of get to our final question, you've given a lot of great advice, a lot of great tidbits that I think a lot of students can take with them. But Michael, we want to ask you what we ask all of our guests. What kind of advice do you have for prospective IO students or students who are just starting out their IO careers?
Oh, sure. I'll give the same advice I gave to the Wall Street Journal. They actually published this one. Uh, and this was to new graduates. So what I think, and this doesn't apply only to IO psychologists. I think this applies, broadly. But even within IO, I think one of the mistakes that people can make coming out of IO is that we all come out of our programs with a professional identity, that says, I am an IO psychologist or I am an organizational psychologist, something along those lines. And that leads people to define themselves pretty strictly in that way. And if you come out of the program and have that, I would just urge flexibility. I think of, starting a career with a kind of, I will ask people to visualize a bullseye target, with, or dartboard target. It's the same thing. Obviously, right off the bat, go for the bullseye. If you can get a job that is labeled, IO psychologist, for a lot of money, working, the high offices of a large respected organization, absolutely do that. Who wouldn't? Those jobs are difficult to come by. It's not, odds are stacked against you statistically. Maybe you have an in, maybe you have use all of your resources. But if you can't get to that dead center bullseye, go to the first concentric circle outside. And that's not a bad place to land because, and I'll say this about the other concentric circles, it's generally the case that once you getting into an organization you want or an industry that you want is the most important thing. Once you're in, you can generally shape the job around your strengths. You can mold the job. Of course, there are things you will always have to do, but increasingly you can, maybe take on, throw in something they didn't expect as an extra. Do something that gets people excited. Start to sell people on expanding your role or changing your role. You can generally mold your role over a 1 or 2 year period. And that's why it's great to take a second job, a second, tier or a third tier. Just land wherever you can, and just have it in your head that you can apply the skills that you learned to succeed at that job. And if you still want to get back into doing pure IO, whatever that means these days, you can. And that's something that I've practiced. When I was looking for my first job coming out of my master's program, I was applying for jobs, and there was such a thing back then as organization development. That phrase has gone away over time. I still think it's important, but as a job role, that's gone away. But I was looking for OD jobs. I was looking at jobs in HR, mainstream. HR was something I thought that was 1 degree of separation outside. That would have been my first concentric circle. And then I went to not the third or maybe the fourth concentric circle. I surprised myself by accepting a job role as a project manager of an educational, a grant-funded educational intervention to change scholastic life, scholastic and life outcomes for a group of limited English proficient, newly arrived Asian American 7th graders. Is that enough hyphens? In the Lower East Side / Chinatown. And I went back to work for my undergraduate alma mater, Pace University, where the job role existed, where they had the grant. And after the first year, the grant almost did not get refunded, and I learned how to write. I had to write the refunding application. It almost failed. The dean of the education school that I was with took me on a ride up to Albany. We spoke to the administrator. He explained to us what the politics were behind, the decline or the rejection of our initial application, and urged us to reapply. And the politics were, and this is New York State politics, just like they are today. Back then, politics were, we were seen as serving a minority that wasn't truly at risk. There was this model Asian stereotype, and I just told them I got agreement on the statement that just because many Chinese Asian students are Intel or Westinghouse scholars, that's what it was back then, doesn't mean that every Asian is a Westinghouse scholar. It's a logical flaw. And I was told, yes, thanks, but can you please resubmit and add in service to another school that has more of a multicultural population to it? And we did. And we won. And that's when I realized how what the background to grant writing for education grants in New York State was like. Now, what does this have to do with IO psychology? A little, and I knew it would have a little. I told myself when I took the job that at least I could apply my statistical skills, and that's what I did. I started doing pre versus post. I took pre measurements and post measurements after each program year, and I was able to show a statistical difference between people that were matched on initial ability, person to person, class to class, that people in our program had significantly better outcomes than the others. And the outcomes we were looking for were progress in English language acquisition for the Asian kids, progress on the Cooper-Smith self-esteem inventory. That's a psychological instrument for some group counseling we were doing. And I think I was the only person out of all the educators that was sending up statistically based evaluation outcomes that made the state look good. It made it look like the legislators were getting a pretty good bang for their buck on the resources they were spending on our programs. That created an upward spiral of success, and suddenly I had streams of money coming from at the federal level, from the state level, from the city level, from foundations, and from corporations into what I called a Center for Urban Education, and that's what it was. So I created an organization from scratch. I used those parts of my graduate training that were relevant, particularly program evaluation and statistics. Research design became program evaluation. Statistics were still statistics, but they were like outcome metrics that mattered. And that created success for me. And on the back of that success, I got recognized and I was able to do other things. And eventually I had the kinds of corporate logos in my little center that I was able to use with PwC, who recognized all of those corporate funders. And they took a chance on me and said, well, you've been working in the nonprofit sector. Let's see how well you can, we believe you can make something happen in a room, Michael. We'll hire you. And I got hired as a consultant into mainstream, top of the house consulting in the organization division of the management consulting services thing. So that's my example of how I was able to work from the third or the fourth concentric circle outwards and get back into the bullseye.
It's great advice, because what we always talk about, the great thing about IO psychology is what it allows you to do. You're not pigeonholed into one specific field, which is why I think a lot of people went into IO psychology in the first place. And what I loved, Michael, that you added is the example and showing how maybe it wasn't your first pick of a job, but you were utilized the stuff that you've learned in your graduate level classes and were able to apply it. And it shows that other students, while it might not be the job that you want, but if you can kind of do that sort of job crafting or bring in those skills that you learned, you can make it a quote unquote IO psychology job, if there is such a thing. But
Right.
it's yeah, it's a great piece of advice, because I know for a lot of people about to leave their graduate program and are looking for jobs, it can be tough to be like, what do I want to do? And then like I was offered this job, and it's like, this is nothing to do what I did the past 2 years. Like, how am I going to be able to apply what I've learned? Um, and I think it's just nice to hear that you were able to do that.
Yeah, no, it's great. And along the way, you learn how to make an argument. It doesn't matter what job you're in. You learn how to make an argument. So today, I can get up in front of anybody, and I do, and I have, and I tell them, listen, behavior equals money. If you don't believe that, just look up the financial definition of how productivity is calculated. Behavior equals money. If you believe that, it's on you to measure money with the same rigor that you measure financials. And if I can get them that far, then I say, but it's not enough to measure only. Nobody has ever surveyed their way to success. You have to be prepared to act on what the measurements tell you. If you're not prepared to act, don't bother measuring in the first place, because you're just squandering shareholder value. And that's so building an argument like that I built similar arguments way back in the education days. I learned how to build arguments that were targeted at helping the client or the funder or whoever it is that you're trying to persuade based on what was important to them.
Yeah, definitely speaking the language of others is something that I've been pulling as a theme from this conversation, Michael. But we just want to like really thank you so much for coming on here. It's been such a pleasure. Joe and I have been talking about getting you on here since we first started this podcast. So to have it come to fruition is really, really awesome. We're really, really happy that we think our listeners are going to be able to hear a lot of great piece of advice that you gave them throughout the episode and really honed it home with the last one. But thank you so much for your time and for coming on here. We really appreciate it, Michael.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. I appreciate the invitation. I'm glad we finally got it to happen.
absolutely.
100%.
Hope to see you
Take
soon.
care.
Hope to see you soon. Bye, guys.
So, Joe, another great episode. It was so awesome to have Michael on here. I know, I think it was my very first Metro event. I had the pleasure of getting to spend a decent amount of time chatting with him and just picking his brain about his career. And I remember turning to you and saying, Joe, we need to get this guy on the podcast. And you were like 100%. So it's really awesome.
My favorite part is how he follows every question that we ask him with an example, because it really hammers down like the message that he's trying to get across. Um, it helped us learn, and I mean, we talked about it during the podcast. When he speaks at Metro, it really helps the listeners kind of like understand what's going on, and he does it in a very intelligent but bite-sized manner. And I know personally, it just helped me learn more about the field in general.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who works in consulting, I feel like I learned a lot of different things that could help me out. But even if I want to go into something else, it was still really relevant. Just always a pleasure getting to talk with him. We really appreciate him coming on here. But thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed what Michael had to say, definitely reach out to him on LinkedIn. We'll have his LinkedIn in the bio. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, you guys.